The Samsung S95B QD-OLED TV is Samsung's first OLED TV, and it marks a big change in the market because this TV now has higher peak brightness as well as higher color luminance because of its implementation of a quantum dot filter on top of the OLED panel, and is competing with the other top TVs of 2022 as well as those from 2021, which are now less expensive. And as I mentioned before, I'll be comparing all of the top model TVs to see just which one is the best for your money. And in this video, we're comparing the S95B QD-OLED to 2021's top OLED TV from Sony, the A90J. Now that TV not only has high peak brightness because of Sony's implementation of a heatsink on the OLED panel, but it also has Sony's phenomenal picture processing, so stick around. Hey guys, it's the Villaman here, home theater enthusiast and lover of all things tech. And as I mentioned before, today we're comparing the S95B to the A90J from 2021. And I'll also be comparing the S95B to the C2 from LG as well as the G2. Those comparisons have proven to be quite interesting because LG's panels are new for 2022 as well with their OLED Evo panel, but today we're talking about the A90J. Now the comparison will be done with the Spears and Munsell 4K benchmark disc, and that disc is great because it not only has test patterns but also 4K video in HDR10, HDR10 Plus, and Dolby Vision. So we'll be able to directly compare HDR10 Plus on the S95B to Dolby Vision on the A90J, which is quite interesting. So the disc will be played from a Panasonic UB820 4K Blu-ray player and set to an output of 10,000 nits. Now I'll be using the most accurate picture preset outside of the filmmaker mode on both TVs because I want the TVs to have some degree of processing still enabled. Now I'm sure you may have heard that Samsung amped up the brightness and color luminance on the S95B for a more impactful picture. That's not entirely accurate, and they may have fixed that on the filmmaker mode, but that's not quite the case on the movie mode, which is what I used for this comparison. So if you want to see more of these comparisons and you haven't subscribed yet for whatever reason, then make sure to do so because I have a lot more to come. Alright, without further ado, let's get into it. This is a pretty extreme test as the brightest element on screen is only 0.05 nits, but the Sony still manages to reproduce most of the test image, more so than the Samsung does. In this next test, the Samsung is more in line with the Sony in reproducing both the 4% and 2% gray slides, but it misses the checkerboard pattern that's in the background of the image. So the winner here is the Sony A90J. Now let's see how both TVs tone map the details of an image brighter than what the panels can support natively. And the objective here is to have a defined step in the brightness of each section of the pattern on screen. And for the Sony, it doesn't do quite as well in the brightest two sections of the test where there is no definition between those two sections. While on the flip side, the Samsung doesn't do quite as well with the two darkest elements. So it's a give and take where the Samsung performs better in the high brightness highlight areas while the Sony performs better in the low brightness shadow areas. In the tunnel test, we see more of the same where there is great definition in the highlight areas on the Samsung while it isn't quite the same on the Sony A90J. In the darker areas of the test, both TVs perform well. The winner here is the Samsung S95B. Now for a test of smooth gradation and banding. And in the quantization artifacts test, where we see how the TVs can reproduce a gradient from an 8-bit and 10-bit source, in the 8-bit chroma blue difference on the left hand side, we see where there's a smoother transition from the blue to yellow on the Samsung, while it's not quite the case on the Sony, where there's a fair bit of green in the transition. Chroma red transition also shows a fair bit of blue on the Sony, which isn't quite as prevalent on the Samsung. Both TVs have noticeable posterization or banding on this 8-bit source as the colors transition from one to the other. On the 10-bit source though, the transition is much smoother in every area on the Samsung than it is on the Sony. An area especially of note is how smooth the transition in the shadow areas are from the lighter to the darker areas with no banding visible on the S95B. The winner here is the Samsung S95B. Now let's move on to a test of motion and motion enhancement, with first using the stock ticker test. And because the pixels of an OLED TV has an instant response, it appears as the images move from one side of the screen to the other that there is judder. This is something you'd notice on an OLED TV with no motion enhancement on, which you wouldn't see on an LCD TV, because as the pixels rise and fall on an LCD TV, the motion blends better. If we now enable the de-blur and de-judder settings on both TVs, we see that the motion smooths out considerably, but it also gains a lot of motion artifacting, especially on the edges of objects. With this pattern, the artifacting on the Sony is more pronounced, but if we move to the moving peppers test, we see that the motion is still smooth, but the Samsung is the first TV I've ever seen which has motion artifacting on such simple objects moving across the screen. The winner here is the Sony A90J. Now let's move on to the HDR video comparison portion using HDR10 Plus on the Samsung and Dolby Vision on the Sony. Now again, both videos are playing from the same source. Both formats are the most advanced HDR standards that each TV supports with dynamic metadata for HDR content. That said, they both render the content in their own distinct way. The S95B presents an overall bright image with great contrast and specular highlights. Though there is nothing outstanding about it, the image on the A90J, on the other hand, is more contrasty and the specular highlights are more pronounced. And this difference is not just due to the perceived color temperature difference based on the white subpixels that the A90J uses for additional brightness output, which the S95B does not. Because of the quantum dot layer that the S95B uses instead of a traditional color filter, it doesn't need the additional white subpixels that exist on the A90J to achieve its high brightness output. And because of that, when recording the screen, the image looks a lot more natural and doesn't have a blue cast or cooler picture that you'll see on the A90J. Once again, we see here where the highlight detail is more defined on the A90J, while not quite so much on the S95B, while the S95B presents brighter specular highlights than the A90J does. You can also see more details in the shadows on the S95B than you typically can on the A90J. In some scenes, I've found that this affects the overall contrast, where on the S95B, the image isn't quite as contrasty and punchy as it appears on the A90J, though it is bright and vivid. The brightness output of the S95B is most certainly higher than it is on the A90J, as you can see in the following scenes. Though both TVs produce a really bright and vivid picture, the difference in brightness as we see here is really as stark as this because they're being directly compared. One benefit that the S95B has over the A90J is just how much smoother the gradients appear on the QD OLED, where in some cases on the A90J you can see minor posterization in the transition between the colors that just isn't apparent on the S95B. In these darker scenes with bright objects, the brightness advantage of the QD OLED is very apparent. The A90J is by no means a dim TV, but in this case it looks very dim in comparison. The color rendition of these TVs would be more subjective based on the viewer, but because of the brightness output advantage of the QD OLED, the perceived vividness of the colors is higher on the Samsung than it appears on the A90J. Now let's compare HDR10 content, and the difference you see in the color reproduction of both TVs isn't because of an advantage of the QD OLED panel, but it's actually due to the way that Samsung implemented their picture curve, which they designed to have the maximum visual impact. So although the picture is so punchy and vivid, it isn't quite as accurate as the one produced on the Sony. HDR video is a tie. Now let's compare viewing angles. And both TVs see some contrast and brightness loss when viewed off-axis. Surprisingly though, it's the S95B that has a slight color shift when viewed off-axis and not the A90J with its OLED Evo panel. But where the Sony is better for the lack of a color shift in the picture, the Samsung wins because there is not as much of a loss in contrast when viewed off-axis. The winner here is the Samsung S95B. Now let's compare the light reflectivity of the screens. And because the S95B is not just brighter than the Sony, it also has an anti-reflective coating that the Sony does not possess. It does a lot better in rejecting ambient light than the Sony does. The studio light set to 100% output is barely visible on the S95B when it's clearly visible on the A90J, especially in the brighter scenes where it's almost not visible at all. You can see the difference that the coating makes on the Samsung when comparing these two dark screens. So what are your thoughts on the comparison? Both the test patterns as well as the HDR video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Now, I think it's interesting how close in brightness the A90J got to the S95B, because at some points the brightness differences were almost indistinguishable. The S95B makes the HDR presentation of the A90J seem subtle when it's not really. It's just that the presentation on the S95B is just that much more in your face, which is totally subjective, and some people may like that impactful picture of the S95B and then revert to the filmmaker mode when they want a more accurate representation, but at least they have that option with the S95B. This comparison though makes the A90J seems like it has a more muted HDR presentation, but that is definitely not the case. It's just that the S95B is cranked up to 11. So I think it'll be interesting to see who out there prefers the presentation of the S95B or that of the A90J. Let me know that in the comments as well. But in this comparison, the S95B is the winner because it does well in so many different areas. Of course, that's not saying that the A90J is bad by any means. It's a great TV and a great alternative to the S95B if you want a bright OLED TV. But the S95B wins this comparison. And currently the S95B is on sale at a price even lower than the A90J, so there's that. So in every aspect, the S95B at this point is a better deal. Now, if the price of the Sony drops to say $500 to say $22 or so $100, then it would be, another conversation to start to say maybe it's a better deal at that point. But at this point, the A90J is more expensive than the S95B, and it's a 2021 model. So not only is it older, but it's more expensive. The price of both TVs will of course get lower as the year progresses, but if you're in the market to buy one now, I think the S95B would be the better option. Don't forget to like the video if you liked it and subscribe for more comparisons, which are on the way. I just need to find the time to edit them. Thanks for watching, and until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood villa man saying be safe and peace.